They laughed. The square of Morada Nova shimmered under a June sun so bright it seemed to mock every furrow of shade. Women fanned themselves with folded skirts. Children perched on barrels to see better. Men spat tobacco and traded jokes. At the center, atop a raised platform, the auctioneer's hammer clacked, and voices rose and fell like gulls. The thing that caught every eye was not the ledger or the raised hands, but the old man standing with a rope at his wrist, hunched, thin as a reed, his hair gone silver, a face scored by years and sun. He moved with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who had long since learned to hide what hurt. Around him, the murmurs were not only commerce, they were a public sport. "Who would pay so much for an old man?" someone asked aloud, and laughter followed, sharp and brief, as if fear could be broken by a joke. Bernardo Costa, rich in acres and quick in his cruelty, tipped his chin and called across the square, "Look how his bones show! Better to buy a mule, Joaquim. At least the mule carries the load." Joaquim Santos stood a little apart from the crowd, a man whose wealth was measured not by showy clothing, but by steady hands and a small, tidy estate outside town. Widowed, thoughtful, he had come to town with a cart of cotton bound for market. He had not expected to take part in any spectacle. When the auctioneer began to rattle off bids for the old man, more jeers than offers, Joaquim felt something in his chest that was neither pity nor pity's cousin. It was a recognition, a small and stubborn flame that refused to be smothered by laughter. 100 milreis, he called out without much thought, but the word surprised him more than it surprised the others. Heads turned. Bernardo laughed louder. The crowd raised the bid, mocking at first, pushing Joaquim to look foolish for daring to step against the joke. 200, 300, jeered the men near the platform. He'll fall apart by morning. Joaquim's jaw tightened. He raised his hand again, firm now. Each number he spoke felt like a small rebellion, not only against the mockers, but against a whole architecture of contempt. When the hammer finally fell and the crowd realized the sale was made, the laughter had a different edge, some scorn, some curiosity, the rest a kind of stunned silence. What would a modest farmer want with the oldest slave in Morada Nova? Before he left the square, Joaquim walked up the platform. He met the old man's eyes for the first time. There was no pleading there, only attention, the kind that notices small things other people discard, the map of a scar, the smell of the sun on a face, the way hands once used for more than holding tools remember that use. "Name?" Joaquim asked. "Donato," the old man said, "but they call me Marco in the quarters." "Donato Marco Antonio," the auctioneer announced to the crowd, as if naming could explain a life. They left the square under the same hot sky, but the town's laughter followed in pockets of conversation. "He'll never do the work of one young man," someone muttered. "He'll only eat and die." The mockery was sharp because it was easy. What Joaquim had done required more than money. It required a decision that didn't fit the ledger of public amusement. If this beginning sounds like the answer promised by the title, mocked for buying the oldest slave, what he did next left everyone speechless, then the first thing to know is that what followed was not a single dramatic act, but a slow series of choices that altered a town not by spectacle, but by the steady insistence of usefulness, dignity, and skill. It began on the road back to Joaquim's farmhouse, with an exchange barely more than a whisper. "Do you regret it?" asked Joaquim as the cart rolled along the rutted road. He spoke as if to himself. Donato, Marco, looked at him and smiled with a mouth that had known both salt and sorrow. "Regret is a road for those who measure by the eyes," he said. "I will not make your fields poor, señor. I will work. If you free me, I will keep your house and the people in it whole." It was not a bargain in the way the town understood bargains. Joachim felt something like a duty and something like curiosity. For years, in quiet moments, he had watched the town's power, who owned land, who owned men, shape what people could be. Buying the oldest slave felt at first like an attempt to correct a small injustice. On the cart ride home, the old man's language hinted at a past that did not belong to a plantation. Names of herbs that rolled from his tongue like music, the image of distant coasts, a manner of describing pain that was observant and precise. There was no insistence of miracle, only the confident claim of knowledge born from need and practice. When they reached the farm, Joachim did something few of his neighbors would expect. He gave the Nato a room near the kitchen, not the slave quarters behind the granary. He told the household it was temporary, an arrangement until he could decide. The cook's eyes widened, and the other workers shifted their stances. But Joachim's wife had been dead for 3 years, and in her absence there was room for another kind of housekeeper, one whose hands remembered more than chores. "Don't call him slave in the house," Joachim said to the foreman. "Not here." The old man, Dom Marco, as he would later come to be called, began quietly. He swept the floor, mended a torn shirt, sharpened a knife until it sang. He listened to Joachim's complaints about crops and to the cough of the stable boy at dawn. He watched how people walked and how they held a wound. He began to be called when a fever took hold or when an accident happened in the fields. The first case that put him beyond the threshold of mere curiosity was a burn, a young woman named Maria who lived in the house as a hired hand. She had leaned too close to a pot of boiling stew, and the skin on her forearm blistered and blackened in an instant. The household rushed, as households in such moments always do, between terror and clumsy kindness. Boiling water, rude bandages, a prayer or two. Pain made people clumsy. Maria's screams cut the kitchen air and drew a small crowd. Marco knelt by the stove. He smelled the acrid steam and looked at the burn with the focused attention of a man who had known heat all his life. He did not say, "Let me." He acted. The description we can give is careful and untechnical. He mixed a salve of oils and crushed leaves until the aroma was green and bright. He eased away dead tissue with gentle hands. He bound the wound with clean cloth, and he sat beside Maria long after the others had returned to their tasks. What astonished people was not that the wound healed, wounds heal in time, but that it did so with a particular lack of destructive fever. Where other burns had become infected on the farm, where scars had split open and fevers had followed, Maria's arm closed and unthrobbed. Within a week she could lift a pan better than before. In a month the skin felt tender and new, the kind of scar that remembered without pain. People whispered about the green smell that lingered in the kitchen. They began to ask Marco for other things. The first whisper of confidence was a dangerous thing in a town like Morada Nova, where reputations were currency and religion and custom counted for more than small folk wisdom. The second case arrived on a stormy night. Pedro, a lanky field worker, had cut himself on a rusted nail on a day of repair. The wound hardened and then swelled. A fever took him by morning. Dr. Augusto Mendez, the town's physician, had been summoned and had prescribed the usual tonics and cautions. Pedro did not improve. His skin grew hot under the palm, his sleep ragged and shallow. The family, desperate, took him to Joachim, because Joachim's name, now associated with that strange purchase, seemed to have opened a door. Marco examined Pedro with hands that did not rush. He cleaned the wound without theatrics, wrapped it with poultices whose bitterness made the young man grimace, sat with him and offered small savory infusions that would keep him taking liquids. He spoke to Pedro not as an object of treatment, but as a person needing rest and a change of toil. The fever broke 3 days later. It was not miraculous. It was the combination of attention, clean dressing, and steady feeding. But to those who had seen Pedro suffer, it was akin to rescue. Word, now slowed but persistent, began to move along the country roads. The old man at Joachim's farm knows how to stop what eats a wound. The third case was a child's fever, a simpler but no less stirring scene. A neighbor's son, fevered and delirious, clenched the hands of his mother through the night. Marco came with a small tin cup of dark infusion and sat at the child's foot. He cooled his forehead with a wet cloth and murmured in a cadence that felt older than the town itself. The fever parted in hours rather than days. Neighbors called it more than care. They called it attention that mattered. The child returned to play with a fierceness that made the mother's knees give way in tears. There were subtler tests, too. A man with a stiff shoulder, who had sworn to never return to the field, found that a series of heated stones and a patient massage loosened years of tightness so he could reach for a bale with less complaint. A woman with chronic cough discovered that changing her diet and embracing quieter hours, advice that Marco offered between poultices and teas, left her mornings freer of the rasp that had shadowed her for years. 3 things tied all these vignettes together for the town: Marco's calm, the sensory details he employed, the bitter smell of an infusion, the cool press of a cloth, and the transformation of the patient from suffering to usefulness. People in Morada Nova measured value in the ability to work, to carry a load, to pay a debt. Here was a man whose work did not carry a ledger line, but whose results lined up in the fields. More hands able to work, fewer wages lost to convalescence, a small rise in productivity and mood. As word traveled, the street vendors who had first mocked the purchase began to hush when Joachim's name was mentioned. Curiosity brought the first visitors, neighbors from 3 leagues away with small coin tucked in pockets and large questions weighing their hearts. They came in 1s and 2s, then in small groups. Marco saw every person as an individual problem and not as a statistic. He made no promises of cure. He spoke of restoring balance, of watching, of making a small and careful regimen fit the life a person lived. People left feeling seen. Joachim watched the change with a mixture of pride and a pragmatic calculation he would later not deny. He saw an opportunity to do good in such a way that it could be sustained. Small fees from those who could pay, a sliding scale for those who could not. He kept accounts not to grow himself, but to keep the work from being a charity that never lasted. He built a tiny room adjacent to Marco's quarters, a place where herbs could be dried and stored, where a few chairs could hold patients out of the weather. He hired a boy to sweep and to fetch water. He installed a simple sign, Marco, care for the sick, and the sign itself became a kind of announcement no voice in the square could quite scoff at. Not everyone was moved. Bernardo Costa did not like the change. He had always measured people by what they provided to the circle of property and prestige, and the idea that a freed old man might disrupt that rhythm felt like an insult. He called the work superstition and mocked the gatherings as superstition in public and small theft in private. Yet even Bernardo found himself, one evening, seeking Marco's help for his own daughter who had been coughing in fits. The very people who mocked could not always withstand the quiet desperation of needing help. There was a deeper shift, invisible at first, in the way work and dignity began to meet. Joachim did something else quietly. He offered Marco the chance to gradually earn his freedom, not by spectacle, but by a promise that if the farm prospered and if the funds were arranged, he would sign the documents. Word of this private bargain leaked. For some, it was charity. For others, it felt like justice finally remembering itself. But with growing reputation came a harder edge. Dr. Augusto Mendez, the town physician, watched the slow trickle of patients divert to Joachim's farmhouse with a professional alarm that would harden into resentment. His practice, built on formal training and social standing, relied on a population that trusted the authority of a man with letters and a book. When those same people began to praise a man without such credentials, Dr. Mendez felt his own authority erode. He began to murmur about charlatans and the dangers of unregulated remedies. In his waiting room, he told stories to donors and the influential. People come here for a diagnosis, and there they go to an old man who talks about leaves. He referred to Marco's work as dangerous because it was unsanctioned. He framed his protests in the language of public safety and professional standards. The town's conservatism acted as a second net around Marco's growing reputation. The church elders were cautious, the magistrates listened politely and then diverted their attention to other matters. Dr. Mendez, who wore his title like armor, did not yet move openly against the newcomer. This would come later, in whispers congealing into a plan. For now, the friction was a slow, sticky thing. Gossip about witchcraft in small taverns. An old woman crossing herself when Marco passed. A pediatric mother hesitant to be the first to call. Yet the number of those who carried gratitude outweighed the noisy handful who carried suspicion. Joachim learned to host people, to listen to their needs, to set a table where medicine was mixed with steady hands and simple honesty. Marco learned to document his work in a small memorandum Joachim insisted on keeping, names, dates, outcomes, so that the care he gave could be described not as folktale but as a record. The farm, once a modest stretch of fields and a few brick buildings, began to change in small architectural ways. A lean-to became a modest consulting room. A storage for herbs moved from under the eaves to a small cedar chest. Donkeys fetched visitors from the main road when rains came. And slowly, the town's center of gravity shifted. Instead of gossiping solely about new taxes or the harvests failing, people began to ask if Joachim's farm would see them, if Marco would have time. In the evenings, by oil lamps, Marco would tell stories in a voice low as the wind through sugarcane. He spoke of long coasts and names of plants that had faces and tastes. He spoke rarely of home. When he did, it was as a place of remembering, not as a longing to return. Joachim listened, and sometimes he would let out a short laugh at a detail that surprised him. An odd little ritual for a fever, a memory of a way to wrap a sprained ankle that made sense in a way medicine books did not. Their friendship deepened without fanfare. It was a partnership of respect. Joachim learned the ways to make room, for herbs, for guests, for a method that required patience more than profit. By autumn, the farm was a place of mild pilgrimage. People came with wounds and coughs and exhausted backs. They left with small improvements and stories to tell. The town looked on with a mixture of wonder and dread. Wonder for what worked, dread for what a changing pattern could mean for established order. Those who had mocked the coughs found their mocking voices falter as they watched neighbors return to work sooner than before. One evening, during a harvest supper, Joachim sat with Marco outside under a sky crowded with constellations not yet named by maps in the town's clerk's hands. There was a quiet between them, a steady peace that had not existed when the old man first stepped off the auction platform. "You could have made it easier on me," Joachim said, "made of your work a spectacle, charged for every hand." Marco chuckled softly. "Spectacle fills a pocket. It empties the heart. I came to know what people needed. I did not come to be praised." "Do you want the papers?" Joachim asked after a pause. "To be truly free?" Marco's eyes shone in the lamplight. "Freedom is many things. Yes, I would like the papers. But freedom that ties a man to a piece of paper without a place in town is thin. I want to be able to live with equal measure, to earn, to teach, to be counted." Joachim nodded. "We will make it so, not now as spectacle, but as opening a door." There were quiet moments when Joachim imagined a future in which knowledge from the old world and the new could meet without rancor. He thought of a small school where young boys and girls might learn to read the names of herbs and the names of letters. He thought, dangerously and sometimes aloud, of how strange it would be for a town like Morada Nova to have a public record in which a formerly enslaved man was credited as teacher and colleague. For the moment, these were private fantasies, told only between two men who had little reason to claim more than the next season's harvest.
Not everyone lets such fantasies pass without accusation. Bernardo continued to snipe in the market, and Dr. Mendez continued his quiet campaign. A rumor started that Marco's work might be profitable to Joachim not because of charity, but because it drew paying customers.
The rumor had a double edge. It suggested cunning where there had been only kindness, and painted their partnership as a crooked bargain. Small stones thrown into the water of the town make a larger ring, and the ring began to reach the municipal steps. Then, in the depth of a dry month, a thing happened that would carry the farm's reputation beyond gossip and into a very public life. A visitor arrived from the city, a lawyer, ill at ease and dressed in the narrow cut of a man who kept his shoes bright. He had a small note in his hand, and behind him walked a man with a limp so practiced it looked like a map of an old war. The lawyer presented a request. A man of standing, Judge Tavares, wished to talk to Joachim about a private matter. Joachim met the judge in the shade of an olive tree, not in the square. The judge was not inclined to be seen as needing help. Status wraps its wounds in silence. He spoke in measured phrases, and when he mentioned a chronic pain that had kept him from sleeping, Joachim thought of Dr. Mendez and the tight lines at his forehead. Yet the judge, with all his caution, had come to Joachim's doorstep, and that fact alone stung Dr. Mendez's pride like a small fire. "Can he help?" the judge asked, after seeing Marco in the modest consulting room. Joachim could have answered cautiously, but he remembered the faces of Maria and Pedro and the child who had been fevered. The truth of what Marco had done lay in the hands that had healed, not in promises. "Come," Joachim said. What happened next began a slow, careful test. It would not be the dramatic spectacle that a town craves. It would be 3 weeks of steady work, of heated stones and poultices, of massages and patience. Within the farm, preparations began not as fanfare but as ritual. Herbs were dried, a straw mattress mended, hot water kept at hand. Neighbors peered from behind shutters. Bernardo spat once into the street and called it witchcraft. Dr. Mendez read the accounts the farm had kept and decided, in the privacy of his office, that intervention would be necessary. So the small drama moved toward its next stage, one that would expose the rifts between formal authority and lived knowledge, between mockery and cautious respect. For now, however, it was still a matter of beds and herbs and the weight of a judge's sleep. And when the judge's carriage left the farm, people watched as if the future of the town had just been packed into a trunk. They had no idea how much the next weeks would ask of patience, or of what it would cost to turn private healing into public validation. They would soon learn that what began as a purchase meant to make a man whole might demand a much larger risk, the risk of public judgment, of legal scorn, and of a fight that measured power not only in land, but in who gets to say what is true. If you want more stories where a quiet choice changes the course of many lives, hit subscribe and stay with us, because this one is only beginning to shift. The judge's carriage turned down the rutted lane toward Joachim's farm as if seeking a place to hide from his own authority. For 3 days after that visit, the town sat on its edges, listening for the slightest sound, a rumor, a carriage return, the clatter of a boot on a stepping stone. Joachim and Marco did not stage anything. There were no banners, no proclamations, only a small house readied with care, and a bed made firmer with straw and linen. The work they would do would require more grit than grandstanding. Judge Tavares arrived with the sort of measured reserve wealth gives a man. A slow step, hands kept away from the pockets that might betray need. He wore the sober gray of his office and a face that had grown used to not asking for help. His pain lived in the way his shoulders never quite relaxed, in the tiny hitch that changed his gait like a punctuation mark. When Marco saw him, he did not lean on show. He simply set the room into a rhythm. Warm water, folded cloths, the hush of attention paid to breathing, to posture, to the places where the judge flinched.
So began 3 weeks that would be talked about for years, not for how quickly they moved, but for how patiently. Each morning, people watched from the garden gate as Marco prepared a small pot of infusion, as he warmed smooth stones wrapped in cloth, as he set music, soft, a voice humming without words, into the room. The judge accepted this odd household orchestra with private skepticism, and Dr. Mendez watched the progress from a distance with professional irritation sharpening into resolve. The first days brought sleep that was deeper in degree, if not immediately in duration. The judge's steps no longer buckled as quickly when he rose. His face, used to a pinched line, softened at times into expressions that strangers almost believed were relief. Marco spoke little, but when he did, it was to explain, in quiet sentences, that some pains were made worse by haste, and that the human frame sometimes required that the mind be convinced it might rest. He taught the judge how to lie with an arm under the knees, how to keep a collarbone aligned with a small pillow tucked under the elbow. He pressed heated stones where muscles held like rope, and massaged with hands that knew not only where to press, but how long to wait for a muscle to answer. Days folded into nights. The judge kept a small journal of the sensations that changed. A night without waking, a walk to the veranda without that old hitch, a morning where he read without pain, cutting his focus. Neighbors took note of the steady progress. In the margins of the town, people who had once said the farm attracted only simple superstition whisper now of steadier sleep than a pill had ever given. Dr. Mendez watched the progress from a distance with professional irritation sharpening into resolve.
Mendez did not accept that an old man with salt-flecked hair could be responsible for changes in a judge that the Academy had not recorded. There were other forces at play, shame most of all. To be refuted by what he had taught as the only legitimate path undermined an identity he had spent years building. He began to gather papers, complaints, petitions. He wrote in the language of regulation and safety, unlicensed practice, unsafe remedies, a danger to public order. He visited the magistrate, asking if the town would tolerate a place where anyone with a few herbs might claim cures. He spoke in what he believed to be sober tones, and produced, in the end, a formal request that Marco be forbidden from practicing without oversight. This letter landed in Joachim's hands like a stone thrown against a window. It did not surprise him, but it demanded response. He had not sought conflict, he had sought care for his people. Yet the town's balance was set by law as much as by habit. Over the course of those 3 weeks, as Marco tended the judge, Joachim worked on a different type of tending, arranging men who could speak plainly about what they had seen, those who could testify not by emotion but by regained labor and steady harvest. Joachim collected names and dates, small records Marco had kept of the people he had treated. He brought lists to the magistrate. He petitioned quietly. He spoke with Judge Tavares himself about whether the judge would be willing to say, in public, what he had experienced. Judge Tavares listened, and then, perhaps because he had come to know the small, carefully kept truths of pain relief, he agreed. There would be a public testimony, but it would not be the sort of boast that breeds resentment. It would be a matter of fact. It would be honest. When the 3rd week closed, the judge rose and walked to his carriage without that old hitch and without the effort that had patterned itself into a man's manner. Word moved through town as if carried in the breath. The judge could walk without his old pain. People gathered the next Sunday, not by decree, but by the way small towns collect for the comfortable cadence of ritual. And when the mass dispersed, the square filled with parishioners, who lingered, for once, not only to fold hands, but to hear. Judge Tavares took the reins of a small moment he knew would matter. He did not shout, he did not call for a spectacle. He walked to the pulpit steps, and in measured sentences he told what 3 weeks of slow work had given him: sleep, less pain, a return to his duties without distraction. He described, plainly, that he had found the care at Joachim's house to be methodical, and that a man named Donato Marco Antonio, whom many called Marco, had helped him.
He spoke of the heated stones, the patience, the steady dressing of a persistent problem. He thanked no one with florid praise. He thanked with the blunt thing that mattered to the town, work regained.
Then he did something more consequential. He asked that the magistrates and the municipal council take the case of Marco's service not as a matter of witch or charlatan, but as one that needed proper respect and, perhaps, integration. The hush that followed was not the hush of the first auction day. It was heavier. It carried the weight of a town that had to reckon with what it had laughed at. Dr. Mendez, sitting in the back with the stiffness of a man who had heard his authority questioned, said little. The judge's measured words had the force of law in them for many listeners. To publicly contradict the judge would be to contradict a man whose position touched everyone's life. That afternoon, the magistrate wrote a short note, more conciliatory than condemning, an invitation to conversation rather than an edict. It was not a full vindication, but it spared Marco the worst of the legal net Dr. Mendez had hoped to cast. The town's tone shifted from mockery to curiosity to an awkward respect. People began to attend Joachim's farm not to gawk, but to ask. There was another consequence that week. Dr. Mendez found himself visited by donors and neighbors bearing uncertain questions about whether men might be both learned and wrong. He read the records Joachim kept, dates, names, outcomes, and felt a part of his professional certainty erode. The man who had long wrapped his hands in the cloth of credentialed certainty had to reckon with evidence of a different kind. Steady records, testimony, the judge's own recovery. Bernardo Costa, who had been the loudest in derision, made a different choice. When his daughter coughed through a long winter, he came in secret, at dusk, to the farm. He watched Marco work with hands that did not hurry, and that night he reconciled a grudging respect with an old pride. In the morning, he walked into the market with a quiet look that said less about mocking others and more about the caution of a man who had learned something new. The legal net had not closed, but the town's public mood had shifted enough for Joachim to take the step he had planned in private. He had never intended the man to remain a commodity. What followed was not a theatrical ceremony, but a careful arranging of papers, witnesses, and legal language the notary required. Joachim knew that to change a status in the eyes of the law required more than a promise at the tavern. He called in witnesses, neighbors who had seen the wounds heal, the judge who could attest to improved health, the foreman who could speak of Marco's work in the house. The notary recorded the manumission with the toning of legal certainty, and the document, once signed, carried weight. Donato Marco Antonio was given his papers. For many in town, the manumission was itself enough to hush the older jokes. For others, it raised new anxieties. What would a freed man do in a town that had measured value in property and inheritance? Joachim had planned for that. He did not want a man freed into poverty. He wanted him free to be useful, to teach, to be recognized as more than a memory. They sat in the main parlor that had earlier seen harvest maps and bills, and there Joachim proposed a partnership that startled even some of his closest friends. He offered Marco an equal share in a small medical venture they would found together. Not a radical redistribution of land or power, but a practical model of shared enterprise. Joachim would fund a consulting room and manage the books. Marco would run treatments, train apprentices, and keep records. They would charge those who could pay and offer a sliding scale to those who could not. In an era when such things had rarely been spoken aloud, Joachim proposed that a man who had once been sold on a platform be made an equal participant in an enterprise of care. Marco accepted with a humility that held steadiness. He asked only that records be kept and that those who came be treated without condescension. They signed a simple agreement, 2 signatures, a small seal, and by doing so they set a precedent. Business could carry both profit and dignity. The news spread. Some scoffed, some celebrated.
The town, which had once measured people only by the weight of their hands in the field, now had another ledger, one of healing and learning. With partnership came growth. The consulting shed became a modest clinic with wooden benches and a small larder for dried herbs. Jacquemin hired a lad to fetch water and keep the fire warm. They appointed a notary to file receipts. Word traveled farther now, not just by gossip, but by a pattern. When you came home sooner to your plow, your neighbor began to notice. People from towns 2 leagues away arrived with coins and with questions about the strange model of practice where a man without a diploma worked alongside a man with land. It was in this season that a young physician named Felipe Andrade arrived. Fresh from a university in the city, Felipe's hair was still the black of a man unweathered by long fields. His coat fit as if pressed the day before. He had come with the expectation that the province needed more shops of formal medicine, that the town would be grateful for modern disciplines. He came curious about Marco because he had heard talk of the judge's recovery and because curiosity often leads young professionals beyond what their lectures promised. Felipe did not bring his ego as an instrument of war. Rather, he brought a hunger to learn. He watched Marco work and found in the old man's hands an economy of practice that textbooks had not taught him. A patience with pain, a sense for timing, the way a poultice's heat could make a muscle yield. Felipe began to ask questions, not to denounce but to understand. Marco, in turn, did not condescend. He explained his observations in terms that spoke of smell, of texture, of what a muscle felt like when it began to relax. Felipe took notes in his small book, hesitant at first, and then with a kind of fascination that builds into collaboration. Dr. Mendez watched this unlikely fellowship with mounting disquiet. Here was a young man who might bridge the gap between what the academy taught and what the fields required. Felipe's presence threatened more than business. It threatened a narrative. If the academy's methods could be enriched rather than supplanted by lived knowledge, then the old dichotomy Dr. Mendez had relied upon shifted under his feet. The 3 did not become partners overnight. There were arguments, short, heated, respectful. Felipe would quote a treatise. Marco would reply with an example from a swollen foot or a stubborn cough. In time, they found a vocabulary to share, language that allowed a poultice to be described without becoming a recipe, and that let a tonic be framed as comfort as much as cure. Felipe learned from Marco the way to speak to a patient so they would trust a regimen. Marco learned to respect certain instruments that Felipe used, seeing them as additions rather than replacements. This union began to change the practice in small ways that mattered to the town. Felipe began to organize records in a ledger with categories: ailment, treatment, response. Joachim insisted on keeping copies. Over time, the ledger formed a strange sort of archive, plain paper bound with twine, each entry a small testament to a life touched and perhaps steadied. These records, when read years later, allowed the farm to demonstrate not magic but patterns. Who responded, under what conditions, and how attention combined with remedies worked. The argument that had been made before with the letter of law could now be answered with the presence of records and testimony, a different kind of authority, forged in ink and quiet numbers. As the clinic's reputation grew, so did the complexity of what Joachim and Marco had started. The income from paying patients covered expenses and left a small surplus. Joachim proposed they use a portion to create a fund for educating children, particularly those who had been overlooked because their families lacked means. It would not be largesse, it would be a public investment. The idea took root slowly. The concept of the fund, seats in a small school, books, basic training in letters and in natural remedies, struck people as both sensible and dangerous. Sensible because education lifts a family for a generation, dangerous because it threatened the complacency of class. The first schoolroom was a spare loft above the clinic, with boards for benches and a black slate for letters. Marco taught the older lads the names of common plants and how to care for a wound. Felipe taught the basics of anatomy and the importance of hygiene, as he had learned it in the city. Joachim insisted on arithmetic. The children who enrolled came from various families. Some had been the offspring of servants, others from small tenant houses.
For a while, the school was no more than a shared meal of knowledge. Over time, reading took hold, then writing, then an awareness that the world offered more pathways than the planting and reaping of one field. The fund also began to allow for a peculiar justice. Joachim used part of it to purchase the freedom of a few other elderly workers, those who had been sold on a whim or whose owners had died leaving debts. He did not purchase them as charity to applaud his name. He organized emancipations as acknowledgments that a town could not call itself decent while preserving the last vestiges of human bondage. Each manumission was handled plainly, with a notary and witnesses. Some neighbors protested, others nodded with relief. The men themselves moved into small houses near the clinic, where they were welcomed into a fold that recognized their skills rather than erased them. Bernardo, once loud in derision, found himself attending a class to learn to read the label on the ointments he had once mocked. He did so quietly, and when he could read a single line in the ledger, he surprised himself by feeling a small pride in the letter on the page. People change in ways that are neither dramatic nor always applauded. They change in the long, patient arithmetic of daily life. There were tensions, of course. Dr. Mendez continued to voice caution about unregulated practice and, in private, spoke to municipal authorities of the need for licensing. He had allies who felt the town's good name might suffer if everyone improvised remedies. Joachim and Felipe replied with records and with the judge's testimony and with the obvious fact that fewer workers were out of labor, fewer babies were made ill by neglect, fewer families were in debt to healers whose prices were extortionate. The council debated, argued, and finally recommended a compromise: allow limited practice under supervision and encourage the training of apprentices under both traditional and formal methods. It was not a full victory for any one side, but it created a structure for exchange instead of exclusion. Time, as it tends to do, carried the experiment forward in ways neither Joachim nor Marco could have fully predicted. The clinic gained a small reputation in the province, and Felipe wrote a short pamphlet, not a medical textbook, but a commentary, on the value of observation and the need to listen to patients. It circulated among physicians with mixed reactions. Some called it interesting, others called it naive. Yet among the people it mattered most to, it served as a bridge, a letter from the city's learning to the farmer's field. Years passed. The modest partnership grew into something that looked like an institution. The original ledger became the core of a larger archive. Apprentices who had once been barefoot in winter became attendants who could record temperatures, who could tie a bandage without panic, who knew how to mix an infusion to the town's taste without pretending it would cure what the academy had labeled intractable. Joachim's farm, once simply a homestead, began to be known as a place that taught as much as it healed. And yet, through all these expansions, Marco aged as old men do. His back bent more, his hand trembled slightly when he stirred a pot, his voice grew softer. He kept his modest room near the kitchen, now filled with washed labels and little jars, objects that had once been the tools of survival and had become the instruments of community. He taught patiently, often repeating the same lesson to a new face. When he walked through the fields, children reached out to steady him because he had steadied them. There came a day, decades after that first auction, when Joachim and Marco sat under the same constellation-spread sky where they had once spoken of schools and the future. Both men were older in ways time marks. Joachim's hair silvered, the lines at his eyes deeper. Marco's, hands spotted and wise. They spoke softly of the farm's growth, of students now able to sign their names, of the small hospital in a neighboring town that sought apprentices from their program.
Joachim admitted that what he had thought of as a small duty had become a cause that made sense of his life. One evening, news arrived that a businessman from the capital wished to see the model. He came with polite letters and an eye for profit. He saw not only care but possibility, a clinic model that might be scaled. Joachim repelled the idea of turning the place into a factory of health. He wanted it to remain a community institution. The businessman left, and the proposal, like many before it, evaporated into conversation. The town's growth would be steady and peculiar, not a product of enterprise and not wholly insulated from commerce. It would, instead, stitch itself into places in the province by the force of example. As Marco's life wavered toward its close, the community prepared in the way they prepared for things that were both sorrowful and important, with dignity. There were fewer of the early mockers in the square now. Many of them had died or moved away. Some had been converted by necessity into learners. A statue fund was raised at the insistence of the judge and Felipe, and a modest committee met to plan a memorial that honored not only Marco's skill, but the dignity he had insisted upon for himself and for others. They did not plan for grand marble or gilded trumpets. They planned for a simple bronze figure in the town square, a man seated on a low bench with a small book at his knee, a symbol of knowledge and repose. Long before the statue would be cast, the town gathered for Marco's funeral.
The procession wound from Joachim's farm to the small chapel in town. People who had once jeered walked behind those who had once sought him for medicine. There was no fanfare, only steady feet and soft words. Judge Tavares, older and now called by the courtesy of his title and by the humility of a man who once needed help, gave a short remembrance at the chapel. Felipe read passages from one of his early ledgers like a witness to the life of a man who had been teacher and friend. The apprentices carried the simple coffin, and Joachim walked beside it, steady as ever, tears held in the well of his chest. The burial did not erase the past, nor did it sanitize it. People spoke in the days after of suffering and of debt, of the cruelty that had bound people like Marco. They spoke, too, of how one decision, buying a man and choosing not to treat him as less, had led to a chain of changes that altered the town in measurable ways. A few days after the funeral, the judge and Joachim placed the first stone of a small building beside the clinic, a room that would house the ledger and the records, a place of learning and an archive for future apprentices. The town would later call it the House of Records, and in it the tiny pages of that early ledger would be kept behind glass. Years later, when the statue was finally raised in the square, people came with flowers and with a caution that was part reverence and part critique. They would not forget that the man had lived under a system that sold him, that humiliated him, that labeled human beings as property. The statue's plaque acknowledged all of that, not to make the town feel better, but to keep memory honest. Inscribed beneath the bronze figure were simple words: "Here lived a man whose hands taught a town that care is knowledge." The new generations who grew up in the school and the apprenticeships carried the model into other towns. Felipe, who became an established physician, with one foot in the academy and the other in the province, published his pamphlet into a small book. He returned often to the clinic, aged but eager, bringing with him other young doctors who wished to learn how the clinical and the traditional might walk together. Some readers in the city scoffed, others took notes. The most important consequence was not a citation in a learned journal, but a few more people in province villages being able to work without the old schedules. The fund Joachim had seeded continued to support children's schooling. Some alumni of the program went on to serve as midwives, healers, or teachers in towns 2 leagues away. Others moved to larger cities, where they practiced with a sensibility that could frame a wound in both physical and social terms. The model's reach was quiet. It was not the sort of change that declared itself on banners. It was present in a ledger, in the way a child's handwriting improved, in the ledger's neatness, and in the small plaques that began to appear over the doors of modest clinics across the region, in honor of lives tended. There were contradictions along the way. Some men who had once owned others still held on to status and refused to engage in the new model. Others found themselves compelled by need to learn a different way. Not every relationship healed smoothly. Dr. Mendez, in his later years, remained a fixture in the town, less strident now and more reflective. There were times when he and Felipe crossed paths by the market and exchanged curt nods. On the whole, however, the insistence on records and the presence of formal acknowledgement by municipal authorities had forced a grudging accommodation. The story that began with a laugh in a town square had, in time, shaped more than a clinic. It shaped memory. With the passing years, the town marked anniversaries. The day the judge testified, the day the school opened, the date of Marco's manumission. Each was a small festival, not of triumph, but of remembrance. They were days to remember that injustice had been present, and that resistance had taken forms both large and small. People asked what the measure of success might be. Was it the statue in the square? The clinic's ledger? The apprentices who went on to practice elsewhere? The children who learned to read? There was no single answer. Success, in the village's telling, looked like the steady decline in the number of families crushed by untreated sickness. It looked like a neighborhood where a freedman could be a teacher and a colleague without being erased by pity. It looked like the small, stubborn habit of listening to a person's pain rather than assuming it a fact of their social station. When Joaquim died some years after Marco, the town mourned a man who had been steady like the land itself. His funeral was quieter than Marco's, not for lack of feeling, but for the way life had settled into new rhythms that required less public demonstration. His will left a small amount to the fund and instructions that the ledger be maintained. The clinic continued, not as the center of a cult, but as a place where people came when they needed steadiness. The House of Records stood small and plain near the square. Visitors from other towns, some curious, some skeptical, would come to see the original ledger. They read names that once meant nothing and now bore witness to human acts of care. The ledger's pages, slightly browned, had ink smudges and corrections. It was not a polished chronicle so much as the record of daily attempts, failures, and patient triumphs. Those who told the story of Joaquim and Marco in later years did so with a sober tone. They did not claim a revolution of conscience across a nation. They spoke instead of a town that learned to notice what it had been discarding: age, experience, a manner of knowing born from necessity. They emphasized, too, the limits, the injustices that remained, the families still scarred by debts, the laws that took generations to bend. The story was, therefore, neither a tidy exemplar nor a lament. It was a complicated tale of slow change. In quiet moments, those who had been close to the work, Felipe among them, would tell students that the most crucial thing Marco taught was not a technique, but a way of seeing. Look, he would say, and then look again, and then listen to what a person doesn't say. The rest is patience. Students took these words into rooms and fields where many things failed and some things began to hold. They learned that humility could be a method and that knowledge belonged to more than one place. Years after the statue was set, a small museum opened in the town to remember lives and to house the ledger, the little tools Marco had used, and the letters Felipe had written. It did not romanticize the past. On the contrary, it placed the hard parts of history in the same room as the lessons learned. Visitors left with a sense that if history could be read like a palimpsest, then this town story offered a page where correction had been attempted. The final line in many retellings is a quiet one. It does not trumpet victory, but asks a question. What do we do when someone we have written off proves to be a keeper of knowledge? The answer in this town was not to set the man on a pedestal and forget him. It was to build a practice, to teach, to make records, and to keep remembering that one small, stubborn act, paying for a life when others had laughed, could change the way a community counted its own worth. What does this mean for us now?
The story of Joaquim and Donato Marco Antonio asks us to look at the people around us with a careful eye, to ask what knowledge we might be ignoring in our haste to mock or dismiss, to consider how dignity can be made institutional rather than merely sentimental, and to remember that healing often comes through patience, attention, and the willingness to bend laws of habit. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that value often hides in plain sight. Tell us in the comments which moments surprised you most and who in your life deserves a second look.